Thanks for having me and showing an interest in Scorn of Creation. Well, Scorn of Creation started with me and the bassist George Prowse. We'd been friends for years, and we'd talked about what kind of band we'd wanted to do together for a long time, but nothing had quite clicked until about 2017, when we pulled a few old ideas together, a few old songs, and started kind of playing them together, that things formed into what would eventually become Scorn of Creation. George and I had both grown up listening to a lot of death metal stuff like Deicide, Morbid Angel, Cannibal Corpse, Dying Fetus, Cryptopsy, all that kind of stuff. And we wanted to make something that represented what we effectively wanted to hear ourselves live when we went to shows. So we put our heads together and thought of people that we could play with that would get that kind of thing across and be the kind of people we could make this music with. And George had played with Sean from Depths and Saving Grace, and he had an old friend, Chris Gillen, who was a vocalist in a band George had been in called Mindfuck. At this stage, we'd already started making the first album, so we got the other two in during that process and full steam ahead from there. The way I would describe Scorn of Creation's sound to someone who hasn't heard us is basically, for the first album, it's got a lot of traditional death metal elements, riff-driven stuff, not overly complex. The whole idea of the first album was to be riff-focused and something that would work well live, something that we could create a good mosh pit with and would have a lot of energy, effectively. So yeah, I would say high energy, riff focused death metal with some solos thrown in there and a bit of lead work going on. As far as leading into our second album, the kind of thing we're writing now is a little bit more interesting. There's a bit more going on. Still that Scorn of Creation sound, the riff focused stuff, but it's a bit more complex and varied as far as influences go, and the overall sound a bit more grand and interesting sounding. For me, the appeal in death metal and extreme metal was the musicianship, mainly, and just the overall rebellion and feel of the genre, imagery, lyrical content, and just the music as a whole. I started listening to it when I was about 15 with my friends at the time, drinking beers and hanging out in a garage, which we'd soundproofed, buying instruments and trying to make bands, and just really living the life of extreme metal at that young age and the whole lifestyle and everything. It tied into who I was at the time, and it's continued to be a part of me ever since. I think that's what's so great about the genre itself, is that it is a lifestyle, it is a community, and it is something that sticks with you and opens your mind musically, I think, to a whole other world that didn't exist previously. Thanks, dude. Glad you liked it. Well, that first album was a collection of things that George and I had put together the years leading up into making the band. So some of it was a little older and some of it was newer. But leading into the next album, things have changed a little bit, and it's all very fresh and all very new. As far as other subgenres of metal, there is an element of other things going on now. I haven't hesitated to bring in influences from other things outside of metal. from movie soundtracks, game soundtracks, other genres of music. Unlike the first album, I think what I've learnt in songwriting now is that I'm not afraid to wear my influences on my sleeves while also being unashamedly myself. So the stuff that you're going to hear in the next album is 100% Scorn of Creation and 100% different than the first album. Effectively, I think the music has just formed into what the band truly is. So there's some very different stuff going on now than the first album. Our goal is to release our second album at the end of 2019. It really depends on a few things going on internally at the moment, whether or not we will get that done. Obviously, if it is delayed or anything changes, we end up releasing it next year instead. We will let people know. But at this stage, it should be the end of 2019, so somewhere November, December, I would say. It really depends on if we can get it out in that time. But the goal is the end of 2019. It's an interesting one. I guess for me, it tends to be just getting the song structures to feel right and be sitting in a good place from a listening perspective. Things like solos and all that, they get added on after the case, once everything's put together. And I do that myself. It takes a bit of time, but it's quite enjoyable. I like doing that. So for me, that doesn't feel like a time consuming part of the process. But yeah, it's the composing of the songs and getting them to a place where they feel like they flow naturally. And then getting the drums done really seems to be one of the longer ones as well. Sean, our drummer, adds his drums to the songs after they've been composed and put together, and he records them in his own studio. So him composing the drums and then recording them and putting them onto the songs. Then we revise the songs again to make sure they lock in with the drums, which just makes the whole process take a little bit of time. So yeah, just making everything flow. The actual song structure is a big one. We've had a really positive response as a band, internationally and locally as well. Every time we've played a show in our hometown, it's been full. A great crowd and mosh pits, and people really seem to enjoy it a lot. And internationally, we had a good response to like our music video that we put out. We got over 70,000 views on that, and a lot of response as far as on our Facebook and things like that, and getting a lot of opening slots with international bands, Cattle Decapitation, Revocation, the Black Dahlia Murder, bands like that. So overall, it's been overwhelmingly positive. 2018 was a really good year for us, and then we took a bit of a hiatus over 2019 to work on this new album. We're hoping that 2020 will be an even better year for us, and the response will be even more positive. I can only really say for myself, but my biggest influences tend to be from a variety of different sources. I listen to everything from extreme metal to a lot of classic rock and all the way to computer game soundtracks, like people like Chris Hulsbeck, who composed the music for games like Turrican 2 and that kind of thing. There's a little bit of influence that comes in there as far as a lot of the lead parts that go throughout the music, but I try to do it in a way that it's not cheesy or 80s sounding or anything like that, but modally and musically it kind of leans on the influence from a lot of old like Amiga games and even early PlayStation games I used to play and things like that. I just really learned about interesting chord progressions and melodies, different ways of using modes, and I always found drawing from other sources like games and movies and things like that tends to work quite well when it comes to guitar solos and things, because you're not going to sound exactly like everybody else because your influences aren't directly from another guitarist. If I were to give you a top five off the top of my head, I would say None So Vile by Cryptopsy, Domination by Morbid Angel, Killing on Adrenaline by Dying Fetus. Surgical Steel by Carcass, which it used to be Heartwork, but Surgical Steel was incredible and I think beat out any of their old albums. Another one I've been huge on in the last few years has been Planetary Duality by The Faceless. It's a great album. It's modern, but it captures enough of that older, genuine sound of death metal that I think a lot of new bands don't quite grasp. Planetary Duality just had that sound that I used to really love in these older bands, but it was from a newer one, so I was pretty happy with that. It's hard to put it down to just 5 albums, and my favourites always change. There's so many bands that I could say, but that's the first 5 that popped into. I'm not involved in any other side projects at this stage, but I am working on some things with another guitarist who I've been playing with. He's someone who might be adding things to some future Scorn of Creation music, even potentially coming in and playing live for us. But that's something you'll have to keep your ears out for. We would love to travel over to Sri Lanka and other countries in the near future. Our goals for our second album is really to try to spread ourselves out a little more and start doing more shows a little further out. We're currently talking about getting over to the Philippines and Australia at the moment, so how much further we'll go with that, it really depends on time and promoters and all that kind of thing. But hopefully we'll get over there and other places in the near future. No problem, and thanks for taking your time out as well. Keep your eye out for our second album and shows coming up in 2020.